Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. On March 24, 2018, a rally will take place in Washington, D.C. It's called March for Our Lives, and it's led in part by survivors of the horrific school shooting in Parkland, Florida. For the sake of this piece, I'm not interested in the policy or politics associated with the planned march, but I do wonder, do rallies like this even work? And how do you lead a successful protest? I spoke to a bunch of experts and advocates for this piece, and here's my big, not so satisfying takeaway. Success in protests, like life in general, should be measured in small increments. The first little increment is getting your message out there and letting it do the invisible work of changing hearts and minds, which should eventually lead to some sort of substantial change. According to Professor Gillion, an expert on social movements at the University of Pennsylvania, protests are a way to deliver information and to create and share a narrative that influences others. So the ideal protest message isn't just, we're dissatisfied with the status quo, here's some clever sign, but we're dissatisfied with the status quo, here's the evidence, here are the facts and figures that support our position, here are the experiences that we've had that led us to this perspective. If those facts, figures, and stories start getting discussed online, in living rooms, on TV, on YouTube, that's a big win. By the way, I'm not an anti-clever sign guy. There just needs to be something substantial that connects to those clever slogans. As Gillion told me, you need to be able to rock and roll with the facts. Anyway, think about Occupy Wall Street. I went into this research thinking it was a massively unsuccessful movement. After all, income inequality, the main target of Occupy, has grown in recent years. But CUNY professor Francis Fox Piven pointed out to me that Occupy introduced the phrase the 1% into our political discourse. The acceptance of that now unavoidable phrase paved the way for something no political observer would have predicted a decade ago.
Sanders has pulled ahead.
The unlikely popularity of Bernie Sanders, in turn, influenced the topics talked about during the 2016 election.
People that are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year pay some tax, because right now they're paying very little tax, and I think it's outrageous.
This is going to have long-term consequences. The Sanders agenda has influenced a generation of young voters, which will put electoral pressure on politicians. In fact, it already has. Granted, none of this has led to a major legislative victory, but it's something. It's progress for the Occupy agenda. Now, protests do more than just shift popular opinion. They also inspire people to run for office. The Tea Party was really good at this. By the way, I'm focusing on American protest movements because frankly, it's easier for me to understand, but of course there have been tremendously impactful protests all over the world. Anyway, the Tea Party movement was founded in early 2009, and just a year later, in the 2010 election, dozens of Tea Party members or Tea Party-supported candidates were voted into Congress. And they have had a major, major impact on US policy, from killing Obamacare to pushing for tax reform. We're seeing something similar in the wake of the 2017 Women's March. More women plan to run for Congress next election than any other election in US history. But back to the Tea Party. One of the things they did really well as a movement was persistence. The Tea Party wasn't a one-off event. It inspired many events. It had social media groups, mailing lists, happy hours, barbecues, book clubs, etc. A Harvard study found that there are around 650 individual Tea Party groups listed on meetup.com. This leads nicely into another characteristic of successful protests. Professor William Gamson, one of the organizers of the first teach-in during the Vietnam War era here in the States, told me that protesters have to build a collective we. In other words, a collective identity, a sort of cultural status that fills participants with meaning and keeps them energized. For Occupy Wall Street, it's the 99%. For anti-abortion activists, it's being pro-life. These are not just slogans or labels. For some people, they're lifestyles. Now, when the collective we appeals to a large group of people, then a movement can grow quickly. And that growth can accelerate when the collective we includes leaders in pop culture, like anti-war musicians in the 1960s, or all the outspoken celebrities associated with the M.cho movement. The Women's March benefited from both these things. It appealed to a very large group of people, women, and it was this sort of pop culture phenomenon. Worth mentioning, building a collective we is a major challenge for minority-led protests. Outsiders look at Black Lives Matter, for instance, and they're tempted to think, oh, that's something that only affects black people. I'm not black, it's not my issue. In other words, relatability is a hurdle minority-led protests have to contend with. So sometimes they connect their agenda to a larger identity that people find it easier to relate to. In the mid-20th century, for example, black activists framed their protests not as black rights, but as civil rights and equal rights. That might be a distinction without a difference, but it simply attracts more people. Framing it that way was a strategy. The leaders of the civil rights movement acted very deliberately, and they picked their battles. For instance, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to get arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. That distinction actually belongs to Claudette Colvin, who now lives in the Bronx, New York, where I live. Go Claudette. Anyway, Parks was chosen as the face of the Montgomery bus boycott because civil rights organizers thought she'd be a better spokesperson. She was older, for starters. Colvin was just 15, although the students of Stoneman and Douglas High School are proving that teenagers can be pretty effective spokespeople.
It's time for victims to be the change that we need to see.
I digress. Pulling off the Montgomery bus boycott required a ton of logistics. Without public transportation, getting all these people back and forth to work was a tremendous chore. But they figured it out. They were well organized, and they focused on the details. One detail of the civil rights movement that often gets overlooked was the sound system used by Martin Luther King Jr. to deliver his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech in August 1963 in Washington, D.C. An activist named Bayard Rustin was obsessed with making sure that sound system was able to project MLK's message to the world. So he raised $20,000 specifically for that purpose. That's something on the order of 10 or 20 times more than what organizers were used to paying for sound systems. And the stellar sound quality of MLK's speech that day is an important underappreciated part of why the message swept the airwaves and is still listened to today. After all, MLK delivered that speech before, but this was the one that went viral before viral was a thing. Now, another attribute of successful protests we can learn from the civil rights movement: nonviolence. One study shows that nonviolent movements tend to be about twice as effective as violent ones. And in fact, violent protests are often counterproductive. Violence is not a big collective we. This is why Antifa has such little mainstream support, even among people who might be sympathetic to their left-leaning worldview. All right, so history obviously offers us a lot of clues on how to lead a successful protest. I really like lists. Who doesn't like lists? So I created a list of attributes of successful movements. But I want to leave you with a few parting thoughts. Professor Piven told me that protests should be disruptive. That doesn't mean violent. It just means screwing with business as usual. That forces people to notice. It makes the movement undeniable, not just something taking place on the sidelines. So when thousands of American students left their schools a few weeks ago to protest gun violence, that messed with the status quo. It signaled to people that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed and that a whole lot of people care about it. It begs the question, what side are you on? The other thing about those school walkouts that make sense, that are consistent with successful protests, they were local. Professor Gillion told me, yeah, marches on DC or any nation's capital are great, but local protests of state houses or politicians' offices are more effective at putting pressure on politicians. Because your congressperson could look out at a huge protest in DC and say, oh my God, those people are super pissed. But when that protest is right outside their office, they realize, oh shit, they're pissed at me.
20,000 teachers from every single last one of the 55 counties in the state are engaged in a week-long grassroots strike over their salaries and, crucially, rising insurance premiums.
Again, this is something the Tea Party movement did really well. A study shows that in areas where they protested, incumbent politicians were less likely to seek re-election. Look, it doesn't matter what side you're on. Protests could work. You just have to do them right. They can also work to counter other protests, but just being mad and taking to the streets isn't enough. There's a playbook and a whole lot of history you can learn from. Oh, also pick a sunny day. Rain is really bad for protests. That's both obviously, but now academically proven. Okay, I'm gonna go live my life. Dude, is the whiteboard done? But really, cool.
Lose sucks.
Great, fantastic.